This is episode 251 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, in many years, this would be a somewhat slow time as we ease on into the Thanksgiving
The
holiday.
winding down to Thursday.
Yeah, that is not the
Oh,
case at all. There has been a lot of news since just last week when we got together and hashed things out. So, yeah, there is a lot to talk about with regard to most notably our least favorite, but almost always discussed topic of COVID-19 and the governor and what is going on in New Mexico. And quite frankly, Wally, it is not pretty. Have you had to venture your way into a grocery store over the last week?
I have not, but I have noticed what happens if you do venture your way. Yes, so the new regulations have made people wait in line. And so the lines are long, at least in the grocery stores in my neighborhood, whether it be Costco, Sam's, the Walmart, the Smiths, they've all had lines.
Yeah, and we're here in a big urban area where, theoretically speaking, there's plenty of grocery stores. I can't even imagine. I know Roswell and Carlsbad and some of these other more, not rural areas, but smaller cities, let alone actual small town New Mexico, where it has to be even more challenging to deal with these new restrictions. Now, what's different this time around is that the governor has imposed not just a requirement on overall occupancy of these stores. Now it's 25% or 75 people total, whichever is smaller. So that means the days of the big box stores in New Mexico getting fat and happy while small businesses struggle theoretically may be closed, because 75 people, if you've got employees at one of those Sam's Clubs, I mean, that's 25 people perhaps right there. So you're talking a very small number in the store of customers. Throw on top of it the rapid response issue. And if you have four rapid responses in a given time period or more than four, you get shut down. So a lot of these grocery stores have a lot of people working for them. And you test enough people, you're going to get some number of rapid response positives. And it's nuts out there, and it's just one of the many, many indications that the governor's one size fits all program in response to COVID-19 is just not working at all. There is no balance between not just economy. We were, of course, criticized early on because we just wanted to kill grandma and keep the money flowing to these businesses. Well, now the worm has turned further, and it's more about, well, can grandma get her prescriptions from the store, or does she have to wait out in the cold and in the line? And all of this is now being discussed at length in the local media and on social media.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. The percentages made sense to me. It's like if you want occupancy percentages, because consider, if you will, a Walmart superstore, how big that is from a square footage point of view, and then to say that they are limited to 75 people in there, whereas you have a very small convenience store, for example. I don't know. It's one of those things. So that they definitely lose on that regard. They also lose on the fact that the rapid responses doesn't take into account whether they have 2 employees or 200 or 2,000. Now, having said that, the big box stores did very, very well while they shut down all small businesses. But now everybody is feeling the pain, but maybe you've gone a step too far. I worried, and I continue to worry in this response to COVID is keeping basic services functioning. And to have a breakdown of the food system would not be a pretty sight in any way, shape, or form. And right now, I'm not saying it's on the verge of breakdown, but it's definitely feeling stress at the very end of the food chain where people get their food in the grocery stores. And the first weekend in which these provisions went into place, Paul, the weather was beautiful, record warm
Right.
temperatures. It was very nice. Well, that will not continue. And so, if you're a 75 or 80-year old man or woman waiting in line on a 70-degree day is one thing, but in the wind when it's 20, 30, or 40 is another. So we'll have to see how that works out. Then you can have food delivered to you.
Right.
So I made a food order on Thursday, and it will supposedly be delivered tomorrow. So there's a huge backlog in
Oh
that.
yeah.
And Paul, I mean, I'm not trying to jinx myself, but I don't have 100% confidence that that food order remotely delivered to me will come about in any predictable, timely, and concise fashion as well. And if it doesn't, then I easily can go out and do shopping in person. Hopefully, get there early enough or late enough to not have to do it. But the point is, there is stress in the system, and it's being felt widely now by this latest order from the governor, and not just in the small
And
business.
it's something I hadn't even thought about, but also the times are constrained. You cannot open businesses past 10 p.m. now throughout New Mexico. And,
And
back,
that was one of my strategies early on was
yeah,
I would go shopping at 10 a.m. or excuse me, 10 p.m. because no one was in the
right,
store back in
right.
April.
So she is really constricting the ability of New Mexicans to get access to food. And yeah, the delivery and the curbside pickup can work for a lot of people, but yeah, going in the stores and getting prescriptions, there's a lot of things that the politicians don't think about that people have to do. And the killer to me is the lack of sympathy for it. The people of New Mexico being expressed by the governor and her spokespeople. Nora Sackett responded to a tweet from Greg Schmiedes about people standing out in the cold for an hour and how that's going to go in improving the health of folks. And that was when it was warm. And Nora Sackett says it's 71 degrees outside. Well, Albuquerque is different from Santa Fe or whatever, but the weather wasn't going to hold at that high temperature. Now it's mid 50s, probably in Santa Fe and points north. It's in the upper 40s. You don't want your 80-year-old grandmother having to stand in line out there. And then this one's KOB. There was a statement, KOB TV, that the talk of lines at the grocery stores were just a Republican talking point. It's just unbelievable how this governor has been arrogant and her people have been arrogant in her entire approach from day one relating to the COVID-19 situation. So, unfortunately, it continues. Couple of odd dynamics. Now, most outdoor activities are winding down. Golf courses are closed, which bugs me because no one ever showed that golf courses were unhealthy or spreading the virus.
And in fact, you might be able to make the argument, there certainly isn't a study on it, that it might actually reduce
Oh yeah,
COVID infections because, if you're out golfing, out in the fresh air, you're getting some exercise that
yeah.
might, for the people who are able to take advantage of it, it might have been a net positive for
But
them.
going into the gym and working out, doing some ellipticals or hitting the weights or whatever, that's not available to you either. Uh, Really odd. Restaurants are no longer having or allowed to have outdoor dining. In the first major shutdown, restaurants threw up tents and all kinds of outdoor opportunities for people to dine. And now that is simply not available to them, to my knowledge. And I don't know if that was a point that was raised by the Restaurant Association, but it's certainly questionable. And then to me, one of the biggest kickers is that despite all of this stuff happening here in Albuquerque, and for us, the real frustration and challenge in New Mexico of what we're seeing on the COVID issue, there are still plenty of people who are coming here and snapping up houses. I defy you, put your house on the market, anyone listening to this. And if you live in an area and have a reasonably priced house, chances are it'll sell within a week or so, or you'll have at least a good offer on it because, especially I know in Albuquerque, the housing market is white hot. So what's the governor do? She puts a kibosh on real estate offices operating. And now, if you're a real estate agent, and say the Drangmeister Estates are up for sale, you have to let the prospective buyer, and that's you as an individually or the real estate agent, go in there by themselves because you're not allowed to accompany them into that building under the governor's order. It's just crazy.
And I read something on the realtor's website that couples aren't even allowed to go in together. So and if you've ever bought a house, if you've been in a relationship, that is definitely a something that's very valuable to the process to be able to compare notes while you're in there. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting rules.
On the restaurant issue, did you?
I have not. No? I've not touched base with the head of the restaurant association on that one. But
because now it's really too cold to have.
Yeah, it's not.
Anything but really well covered. Maybe that's the argument is, well, a tent that can cover you from the cold temperatures is going to be too much of a tent to allow the virus to go into the ether because I guess that was the theory the first time is that outdoor dining will be safer, indoor dining, which could involve tents and any other enclosures, is too dangerous. But
Paul, there's this group that's called the Recovery Council, which is we need them to do their job. But one of the things I thought they were supposed to do was provide feedback from industry points of view on certain things such as this. And so either they're not doing their job or they're not being listened to. So when it comes to things like these grocery store shutdowns in terms of, it just seems like the chord is being struck very wrong on things that require broad-based rules and policy. That's where they micromanage, and things that should be micromanaged, that's where they do broad policies. It seems like it's been turned upside down on its head. And so it's still the issue of small businesses. I guess they can do delivery, but you need to reduce your employees by 100%. So if you reduce your employees by 100%, how can you even deliver? So there's a lot of questions out there, and I'm not saying that I'm an expert on it, but I have business people that I talk to have these questions, and I don't know the answers to them, but there is incredible frustration out there over how this is being administered.
Yeah, and state parks are also shut down, dozens of state parks. Now, the reason this was much remarked upon and much noted earlier on is because folks down at Elephant Butte and at the lake down there were very up in arms about having that, big economic engine taken away from them. Now, if people are going to the state parks, it's much more just to go hiking or something else. But still, it's another outdoor exercise, recreation opportunity that's taken away for very dubious reasons. And something else that's worth noting is that the city of Santa Fe has closed their, parks and jungle gyms and those kinds of things, which that's unfortunate as a parent of small children. Thankfully, and I'm not giving anybody ideas here, but so far, Mayor Keller has not done that in Albuquerque. We will see. Hopefully, he continues with that. And finally, all of that is to come on top of the fact that the film industry is not shut down in New Mexico. They continue to film under a separate deal that they struck with the governor's office some months ago, and has provided some testing mechanisms, et cetera, for film crews here. So now we're just in this Alice in Wonderland situation.
Yeah, it is difficult to make sense of why these policies were put into place and what the rules are. And then I don't know if it's on your list of things, but then the college athletics thing is is a very interesting one when you have the men's and women's basketball teams at New Mexico State and the University of New Mexico. They they moved their programs to Arizona and Texas because the rules allow them to operate there, but not here in New Mexico. And again, the governor, I saw a quote attributed to the governor's spokesperson that was tersely worded, to say the least, with regard to them doing that.
Yeah, that one is, boy, it makes the conversation about merging the Aggie and Lobo basketball and football programs that we kind of had tongue in cheek back a year and a half ago. Look, if you made that prediction, I think most people would have said that might come true. But the idea that the basketball and football programs from both schools will be sequestered in some other state, not just other states, mind you, these are states nearby to New Mexico where the virus is actually even worse currently based on most metrics. But that's the world we live in, Wally, and it is just absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and I do want to say, Paul, the virus is running rampant. You know, the article in the New York Times about New Mexico showing how tightly we are shut down, and yet it's not been effective.
Right.
So that's the key. You know, it's one of those. If we're the most tightly shut down state in the nation, and we're doing fantastic during all of this, again, not an epidemiologist, just observer of reality right now, you'd say, maybe this is working. But it calls into question the whole strategy of masks and social distancing as being that big of a factor. And again, I've never been an anti-masker. I know there are a lot of them out there. I begrudgingly wear my mask everywhere I go. I follow the rules, but I am dubious of how big of a difference it actually makes. And then I'm hearing from people who would indicate they know that much of the spread isn't coming from businesses; it comes from large family gatherings and things like that. And so, what do we do about that? It's one of those that reminds me of we kick the dog for the misdeeds of grandma when things happen. You know, are we really attacking the problem where it lives? Are we just have this talisman of what we're doing? We're so strict, but then again, it's not working compared to places that are far less strict.
You got it. Yeah. If it was working, I think a lot of folks would be happy to give up some of their freedoms on a temporary basis, at least more understanding of the situation. But the article you mentioned is One America, One Pandemic, Two Realities. And it really compares South Dakota and New Mexico in both their COVID approach, but also their economic approach, which the COVID data aren't all that different between South Dakota, where, as the New York Times columnist or reporter described it, you wouldn't even know there was a pandemic. In New Mexico, where you cannot escape the pandemic no matter where you turn. And the data just are not overwhelming in showing that one state has done a better job than the other on the virus. Clearly, the economic data are very, very different. But anyway, yeah, great mention there, Wally. And well, we're having a special session on Tuesday on top of everything else. And yes, this will be the second special session of the year of our Lord 2020, which cannot get in the books fast enough for most everybody out there. This is a tentative list of some of the bills being discussed. It should be a very short session. It's mostly to give out CARES Act funds.
Federal funds that New
yeah.
Mexico needs to spend.
Yeah. So, this is not the governor dipping into New Mexico state coffers for much. It's mostly federal dollars. So Supplemental unemployment benefits, $194 million dollars to provide a one-time supplemental compensation benefit of $1,200 to eligible recipients. Grants to New Mexico businesses and nonprofits, $100 million dollars to provide grants up to $50,000 for those entities. General assistance, $5 million to provide up to $750 per household that people on welfare essentially. Emergency housing assistance, $15 million to contract for services to provide emergency housing assistance via federal community development block grants. Emergency food bank assistance, $5 million. Contact tracing and testing, $10 million for more of that. And then $200,000 for emergency pay for the courts. As expected, kind of a yawn. I mean, I think we all want these dollars to get out into the community and hopefully help folks in need. Of course, the CARES Act and most of the rules and regulations in it are coming to an end in December. The transition, which we don't have time to talk about, the transition to President Trump and President-elect Joe Biden, we're just going to take a pass on that. But you can expect that whatever happens, that among the first orders of business will be another big round of stimulus and COVID-related spending coming out of Washington, D.C. Any thoughts on those? That preliminary list of special session bills that they're considering?
Well, the thing that strikes me compared to what they did in the previous session is this actually helps the people directly as opposed to bailing out government. And so in that regard, is it better? It probably is. I think it is. You know, the question of how much money should the federal government put into these things, and, you know, what was the right thing to do. But the bottom line is that money is there, needs to be spent. And yeah, I have a feeling they'll get in there. These things tend to be, what shall we say? These skids are greased. You know, they get in there, they pass them, they get out. The other thing is less so maybe than it used to be, but our legislators are, a lot of them, not spring chickens. So they fall into the high risk category. So I'm not sure a lot of them, nor would I on their behalf want them there. You know, not to mix too many subjects, but it's one of those things, the idea that it's COVID is a way different risk profile for a young child compared with a 70, 80, 90-year-old person, particularly with underlying conditions. And that describes a lot of our legislators.
Yes, it does. And while we're on that subject, I'll briefly mention that my monthly piece in the Las Cruces Sun News ran. It's also posted at Errors of Enchantment. New Mexico's school situation, scientifically dubious. Basically, everybody in the science community has basically agreed, and, you know, yeah, science is science, but in this case, they seem to all agree that COVID-19 situation is not something that should keep kids out of school. Children, for a variety of reasons, are best served by being in school, precautions taken, but they're not little vectors out there for spreading the virus. And I write about that, as well as some of the states, including Oklahoma, Idaho, and Texas, that I've mentioned in a previous podcast, that are giving out CARES dollars to help parents and families affected by the COVID situation and the lockdowns. And it's it's an issue that is unremarked upon, undiscussed by too many these days here in New Mexico, where it's all about propping up the existing systems, not actually helping kids or parents. And that leads me to a dialogue that I had. Call it what you will. Dialogue is as good of a word as any. Rena Zerpansky, she is the one of the few regularly employed, full-time employed people working in the New Mexico legislature. And she works with Brian Egolf, the Speaker of the House. And we did have a brief dialogue, and I've known Rena for a while. And I really do like her, but the fact is that she was on Twitter, and again, Errors of Enchantment. You can find this. Indoor dining and gyms open, schools to close. And then she writes, maybe one of the biggest policy lessons of COVID in the US is that we don't have real advocacy for children, or that we are unwilling to listen. And she, of course, she cites a New York Times tweet saying that the schools should remain open. And our response was, in all seriousness, has Speaker Egolf spoken to the governor about this? If he has advocated privately to keep New Mexico's schools open, what has the governor's response been? If that hasn't worked, has he spoken publicly? I haven't seen anything. And, Speaker Egolf's not just a guy, he's a pretty powerful guy in this state. I haven't heard anybody close to the governor politically say anything about keeping the schools open or handling this crisis in a different way. It's been, you will do it, and it's crammed down on everybody else.
Yeah, I was struck by some of the comments that Catherine Stevens made, Tipping Point, New Mexico, episode 248. And the whole idea about the children who are marginal learners and struggling academically, what this shutdown may do to them, and also what may be necessary to get them in a position where they actually can succeed academically, and how hard that may be. And so, yeah, the school, everything is shut down. We are a one trick pony. We don't differentiate. And, just Paul, every now and then people say, well, what would you do? It's like, you know what? I would just say, let me just be honest. I am not an expert. These are very tough calls. What would you do? There's no easy answer, but it increasingly seems to me that a strategy where you protect those that are elderly with underlying conditions and you give more freedom to those that are younger and healthier may be something that we ought to absolutely consider. And that's not been done in New Mexico.
I agree with you on all of that, and we've discussed some of this. One thing that I'm going to throw into that bucket, if you will, of COVID responses that I hadn't been aware of. There's a Politico article, Politico, the website, why the U.S. doesn't have an at-home coronavirus test yet. And it seems from reading this article that there are companies that if they were given the go-ahead to actually bring a at-home, kind of almost like a pregnancy test in its simplicity and the way results are portrayed, Americans could get an understanding of whether they have coronavirus in a highly accurate, but maybe not as accurate as some would like, manner. And this is something that we're going to be at least discussing here in the days ahead. But if you're interested in following up on that, Politico's story, why the U.S. doesn't have an at-home coronavirus test yet. I got it from reading originally from reading my trusty copy of Reason magazine, and I went researching and looking at a little bit more about that, because that's definitely something I'd like to see the FDA put out there, and also that the governor can use the bully pulpit to push for that kind of test to be made available. The article is from October 21st, 2020, so it's a very new article. Wally, we have more to discuss, and specifically our friends at Voices for Children. We had a lovely conversation with them also on Twitter about the corporate tax situation, corporate income taxes. And Bill Jordan, who is the lobbyist for that outfit, he was on Twitter claiming that the wealthy and corporations either pay too little tax, or in the case of corporations, don't pay at all. And a friend of ours, friend of the show, Jason Espinoza, reached out to me in seeing this Twitter debate, and he actually showed me a document that, everything is accounted for in, whether it's government or whatever else. The actual line item where you see the deduction made for the spending on film subsidies comes out of the budget under corporate taxation.
Yeah, and it's one of those. What do they call that? They call that tax investment, or they have euphemisms for it. But yes, the point of
Tax incentive, I believe.
yeah,
CIT, I
yeah,
think is what.
but anyway, yes. So what is the number one beneficiary of that program? So
Yeah, it's definitely the film industry. And the article goes on to note that, and this is, again, heirsoфenchantment.com. You can find the site directly from the Legislative Finance Committee. It's noting that, we are not a state that depends heavily on corporate income taxes. We don't have many major corporations here, and that's going to change even for the worse as P&M leaves or their main operations go elsewhere.
yeah, that was one of the big lessons of 2007, 2008 is you could have raised the corporate income tax to 100%. It wouldn't have made a huge dent because there are not a lot of corporations operating and paying taxes in New Mexico. And it's largely government, and a lot of business is done in pass-through entities, LLCs, and partnerships where people pay taxes as individuals, not as
They're
corporations.
not avoiding taxes. They're just not paying
pay
as
it.
corporations.
They
I know.
pay it differently.
Yeah, I know.
And actually, for people who are self-employed, it's usually a lot worse than, so.
Just explaining to Bill Jordan and the others in the back.
Does he might know that? It's one of those, is Bill ignorant or apathetic on these issues? He doesn't know and he doesn't care because it's tough to have these arguments with him because it's not really facts-based. It tends to be very emotion-based.
Here is a snippet of a quote from the Legislative Finance Committee document. Credits are expected, so that's credits against corporate income taxes, are expected to grow to $165 million or higher in fiscal year 23 as additional productions qualify. That's obviously film productions.
Yeah.
Film tax credits are expected to quickly outpace corporate income tax revenue growth in the forecast horizon, causing the revenue source to drop to $1.9 million in fiscal year 23. So that's essentially saying that with your corporate tax revenue in New Mexico, at 1.9 million given a $7-8 billion budget, you're talking about zero corporate revenues. But that's because the film subsidies are being booked against the corporate tax revenues. And of course, Voices for Children, we're still waiting for them to talk about how Hollywood subsidies are a big bad thing that we should get rid of. And again, from our good friends over at Voices for Children, they were in the Albuquerque Journal making the favorite argument of arguments that we love to talk about, which is get rid of oil and gas and replace it with nothing. I think we already hit this in the last episode, so we've got plenty to talk about. But yeah, they had an article in the Sunday paper a week ago in which the Voices for Children followed Jerry Ortiz-Pino's line about let's just keep going with these green policies, and when we eliminate oil and gas from New Mexico, we will not have any way to fund our government or build our economy. So I apologize for a bit of a redo on that one. But finally, let's see. Or no, ERB, the Education and Retirement Board, has decided to divest. That means to make a formal policy to not invest in a particular business or group of businesses. In this case, private prisons, correction, and rehabilitation companies. And the Albuquerque Journal had a very good editorial on this issue in which they said that, where does it stop? You just keep going and keep pulling industries out that you don't like at that given moment. Where does that leave you? And I think it's a very fair question. And Patrick actually had a column in the Albuquerque Journal, a brief article in there in which he discussed the way the reality is for companies that have been hired by the state to handle whether it's prisons or other correctional facilities, rehabilitation facilities. Patrick and I both got to tour some of these facilities here in New Mexico, and consistently the people involved, the inmates or treatment people being treated for drug addiction, said that they were very well operated, very good, and offered a lot of things that weren't available in other facilities that were operated by the state. So it just, it's one of those things because the idea is the Trump administration was using private jails and prisons to house, illegal immigrants who had been taken in, and the children and the cages and the whole 9 yards. Look, I'm not here to discuss federal immigration policy. If you don't like that, that is a Trump/Obama policy. It has nothing to do with who operates and maintains the facilities themselves. Those are just facilities that are available, and it's just another left-wing hobby horse to jump on and ride no matter what the reality of the situation is.
And these funds that don't invest in certain things, kind of virtue type of funds, are they're not that new of a thing, but it's almost like this whole idea of the cancel culture. You have this bad thing against you, and so you can never be forgiven, or this industry did this. There's no way we should invest in that. I would defy anyone to have any industry that didn't have something that somebody would think is inappropriate. And I haven't looked at this research in a long time, Paul, but the last time I looked at it is these funds tended to underperform just broader based investments because, just how it's at times difficult to pick exact winners and losers on individual stocks. If you arbitrarily start including things, either the math has tended to not work out real well. And so I have a feeling we're going to see more of this in New Mexico at the rate things are going, is my concern. So then we don't invest in energy, we don't invest in social media, we don't invest in media, we don't invest in food because they use Monsanto. It gets to the point where what are you going to invest in? And if is it capitalism you don't like, or is there just little slices that get increasingly big over time?
Yeah, if we're just talking about an individual and their own resources, by all means, they have every right to not invest in companies they disagree with, whether it's alcohol companies, tobacco, firearms, defense contractors, or any other, energy, like you said. But this is a government board investing on behalf of all the employees who have paid into it, in this case, education employees, teachers, etc. So the idea that this board, that chances are very few people who receive or will receive pensions through that board will know what's going on and who's making decisions on their behalf. It just becomes a political power grab for the special interests. And yeah, where does it stop? I think it's a very open question and scary to contemplate. One more before we get to the Freedom Index and the latest results in that report, but you probably missed it because the media, they did report it to their credit, but they buried it on some other page off the front page. I can assure you that if this kind of success had happened under a different president or for different reasons, they would be shouting it from the rooftops. But according to the Washington Post, greenhouse gases generated by the U.S. economy will slide 9.2% this year, tumbling to the lowest level in at least 3 decades, according to Bloomberg/NEF, National Environmental Federation, I assume, or Foundation. Now, of course, that's partially due to the pandemic, but we've seen dropping emissions of CO2 for several years. So I think it's not surprising that even with President Orange Man Bad in the White House, that CO2 emissions in the United States continue to decline. We're on pace, actually, now to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement which President Biden plans to get the United States back into. And if the economy, when the economy returns back to a more normal situation, it'll be a little more noticeable if people are trying to adhere to those Paris climate numbers. But the fact is that the U.S. has continued to grow and get more efficient, and despite a very tough year, because of a very tough year, we've seen further drops in CO2 emissions. I expect that CO2 will continue to go down from the United States, rise dramatically in foreign countries like China, and we can handle it, but how much can we handle? Obviously, we're all hoping that COVID goes away yesterday, but people will return to more normal patterns of travel, especially flying in planes.
Yeah, and this has been a long-term trajectory that the U.S. economy's been on. We were certainly a very high emitter of carbon dioxide, but a lot of policies and a lot of technological innovations has moved us the other way, moving from coal to natural gas. Some would argue moving from coal to renewables, but renewables really are natural gas because they're needed much of the time to make it happen. Better fuel economy in our cars and light trucks. We've made great progress, and so even though the United States wasn't in the Paris Climate Treaty, we were making great progress towards that. And the Paris Climate Accords, have a lot of things that are not necessarily good for the environment and good for emissions, but very bad for American economic activity. And that's one of the reasons I think that the current administration in Washington got out. And so it begs the question, is it better to be out of the Paris Climate Agreement and meet the objectives as opposed to being in it and not meet the objectives? I think we might get a chance to see that in the next few years.
Yeah, I think you may be right. Once the economy starts to recover and returns to normal, I think that we may see a burst of tourism like we've never seen in this country. People will say, I am sick of the four walls in my house and I am going to get out and travel. Of course, there's also the flip side of that, which is that coal-fired power plants, either by market forces or by government diktats, coal is going to be reduced in the years ahead.
In the United States.
In the United States.
Yeah. Now, whether it will be in India and China, that's a very open question at this point.
That's very true. And of course, the San Juan Generating Station in 2021, and even if they keep that open and use the carbon sequestration, which maybe that could become a model down the road for other places, but that would obviously still have a net very positive impact on CO2 emissions regardless. But just thought I'd share that little news bite because it's not something, would have been nice if we'd had more of a conversation about that prior to the November presidential election.
Yeah, without a doubt, it's very interesting. So good job, America, reducing our emissions.
Exactly. And finally, the latest index of economic freedom is out, the Economic Freedom Index of North America, published by our friends, the Fraser Institute of Canada, a free market think tank up there in the Great White North. Yet again.
They shout out an A to our friends in Canada. And what do they say?
They say that nothing is new in terms of New Mexico. We are still among the least free states in the country. You can go to errorsofenchantment.com. You can click on the link and read all the gory details. But
are you going to give us a number? Are you going to make me go to the website?
Seconds. We're 40 seconds.
Oh, we're not 48th?
No, we've gotten a little bit better. But I expect that when Michelle Lujan Grisham's policies really start to take hold in this index, we will start to decline quite dramatically. Notably, if you look around the region, they go by quartiles. The map is the most easy and user-friendly thing. Arizona, Utah, Colorado are all in the second quartile, so among the most economically free, but not in the top 25. Texas and Oklahoma are both in the top 25. The only states as unfree west of Minnesota are in the mainland United States. So looking at that line west of Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana, all of which are more free than us too. Well, Minnesota's on our par, but only Oregon and California perform in the range that New Mexico does. And the most notable thing to me is they include a chart which shows that when you look at states and provinces and even Mexican provinces, the least free have the real, that's where the real impact is experienced. We're 8.1% lower income across the board, not just us, but other places that are least economically free than the median of that country. In the terms of the second and most free quartiles, they're basically on par with each other. It really matters when you're in that lowest quartile. When you're the least economically free place, you really get hammered.
Yeah, and then when you talk about median income, that's not whether big business and rich people do well. That's how well the citizens do in that country, and that's why this is important. We're in that danger zone, and we're in striking distance of getting to where it continues to be really bad, but we're not. Again, we're not 48th or 50th. With some reasonable policy over a period of a few years, we might move the other direction and help the earning power and the success of our people, our workers, our families here in New Mexico. That would be a good thing.
That is a fantasy of the highest order, Wally.
But it would be a good thing, wouldn't it, Paul?
It would be a good thing until I was just going to say that until we get rid of our current governor, I see no improvement in New Mexico's economic freedom. And I'm not sure the legislature will do anything as well in its current iteration. But we will leave it there. Thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter. And tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.